Hello, 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 and welcome to our podcast called either A Radical History of Math or Radical Mathematicians. We haven't decided on a name yet, but get it. It's a pun. I'm Sydney, and I'm here with my dad, Doug, and this is going to be a podcast where we talk about mathematicians through the ages. So each episode we're going to pick a specific mathematician, the good ones, the bad ones, the quirky ones, and just discuss them give our take. And through that, kind of give a chaotic overview, hopefully, of the big picture as well. Just a disclaimer, neither of us are experts. I just got my degree in biology/computer science, and my dad did undergrad in math, philosophy, and economics. So neither of us are experts, but hopefully you'll stick with us and learn a little bit. And yeah, it will be fun. We're going to start with the first mathematician, Thales, an ancient Greek dude. And he was the first mathematician/scientist that we know of. Except Thales didn't do a whole lot of science or math simply because he lived so long ago and the subjects didn't exist back then, and it's hard to study a subject when it doesn't exist. I'm really hyping this guy up, aren't I? Thales, he didn't do much, but he was there. I think being the first probably counts for something, but we don't really have any qualifications to be doing this podcast either, so I relate to you, Thales. I feel ya.
Anyway, Thales was considered one of the founders of the Golden Age of Greece, one of the intellectual founders. He lived in Miletus, which is an ancient city. Is it still a city or is it just ruins now? It's just ruins now.
I think it's just ruins.
So Miletus was an ancient city which is located on the western coast of what today is Turkey, but it was considered in the Greek sphere of the ancient world. Of course, there was no Greece, there were no countries back in 600 BC, but it was settled by Greeks. I think it was actually considered a satellite city settled by Athenians. Pretty ancient. It was probably around for 1,000 years by the time Thales was born. It was in 1000 BC, there were literally no cities in Greece. There were villages. And by 600 BC, there were a dozen small cities. I'd say Miletus had maybe 25,000 people, so sizable. It was on a bay. It's no longer on a bay because the bay is silted up now, so it's actually 10 miles inland, which is weird, which may explain why it's not inhabited now, because it used to be a trading port, and of course now it's landlocked.
Yeah, it's it used to be on the shores of the Aegean Sea, on the banks of the river Meander, which, do you know the word meander? Probably.
It is familiar.
It's where the etymology of meander comes from.
The Meander River.
Yes.
It's also where the silt came from.
Yes, it's also where the silt came from.
Anyway, Thales was born in Miletus. It was maybe one of the 2 or 3 wealthiest Greek cities, maybe in all of Europe, possibly in all the world. Now it's just ruins, but they appeared to have a pretty nice lifestyle. They had a really nice amphitheater. They had a port full of ships. They traded.
Yeah, they traded a lot, actually. The Greeks were super into that whole colonization thing at the time and were all over the Mediterranean. They were everywhere, from the Black Sea to Spain to North Africa. They had these trading posts called emporiums, and they think that Thales actually visited one of these in Egypt. So he went to Egypt, he possibly went to Babylonia, and he potentially plagiarized all of their ideas. Maybe. Greece obviously didn't have the same amount of history as Egypt or Babylon at the time, so the Greeks were just getting started, right?
Yes, this is considered the classical age of Greece, a few hundred years before the Hellenistic age, which included Plato and Socrates and Aristotle and Archimedes. But those folks lived hundreds of years after Thales.
Yeah, he was. I think Aristotle was the one who was like, this man was the first, or at least the first Greek philosopher. If you go to Wikipedia, it says that Thales is recognized historically as the first individual in Western civilization known to have engaged and entertained scientific philosophy. And it also says that he's the first known individual to whom a mathematical discovery has been attributed. So there was obviously math discovered before him. We just don't know the names of the people that discovered it.
That's right. He's several theorems are attributed to him. We can't really be sure, but so it's not really known if he was born in Miletus or he came to Miletus. Some historians think he came there. He was actually Phoenician, but other stories say he's from a wealthy family, a wealthy established family in Miletus. One thing is for sure, he was probably had, if he studied math and astronomy and science, he probably had a lot of leisure time. He was probably an aristocrat, or at least somebody who was at the upper crust of society.
So I think the first thing that Thales is responsible for was his theory about the first principle, which he thought was water. All these philosophers in Miletus started speculating about the material constitution of the world, and he was the first of these philosophers, and he wanted to attribute basically all matter, living and non-living, as from some sort of originator, some sort of like unifying theory of everything is the same in some specific manner. I guess he wanted to figure out where everything came from, which is, a lingering philosophical question. And somehow he got to everything comes from water. It's the first material. It is the origin of all things. It was very unusual for the time because there's not really much that relates like a rock and a human being. And Thales was like, oh, they're the same thing. And for some reason, he was like, you know what that rock has in common with that baby? They're both made of water.
Well, he was a keen observer of nature. There was
he also
already,
thought rocks
I think,
were
the
made
idea
of
of earth, fire, air, and water. But he, decided that there isn't four different things. You would think that the idea that everything is just one would be pretty radical, because when you think of all the different substances, you would think that you would need at least four primordial things, and then you could mix and match them in different combinations and get different substances. But with one thing, how do you get all the different objects on the earth, all the different kinds of metals and rocks and substances? But he insisted that everything was one, made out of one primordial thing. And the reason that's kind of important is because it's not that far to go from that to Democritus's idea that, Democritus asked, is everything continuous or everything atomic, discrete? And he would not have made that step, I don't think, if Thales had not come up with this idea that there is one primordial stuff.
Well, actually, his student, Axamander, proposed that things were all made of Empyrean?
Air.
No.
Gas.
No.
Plasma.
No. That was Anaximenes.
Anaximenes. He was
that was the air guy.
Student.
Anaximander thought that all things were made of Empyrean, which is infinity. So he thought all things were infinite for some...
I thought Empyrean was just air. No?
No, that was a different dude.
Oh, okay.
Everyone in the Miletus school had their own chosen element. Water, air, same thing. So,
which to me is kind of a dick move. Because the real important thing is that Thales came up with the idea that there was one thing that was primordial, and just changing the name is kind of more rhetoric than anything else. But I guess he had to be a little different.
So he was apparently a, what did he call this? Material monist? Is that how you
now we call it monism.
Monism?
But he didn't call it that.
Well, he spoke Greek too. I don't think he called it really.
Monism is the idea that at some level, nature is really just composed of one thing, which is a new idea. In fact, maybe his best idea.
And the reason he decided that water was the, I guess, generative material was because water was the only element that moved. I think that was sort of his logic behind that.
Well, air moves.
He actually thought that every part of air was moisture, and he got that idea from mist. There's a theory that he thought that the sun drying up parts of the air is what made wind. So he was kind of on the whole air is actually water thing. He was on that bandwagon.
Fire moves.
He also thought fire was water. In case you guys don't think that's a leap of logic.
He decided on water for whatever reason.
So Thales lived on the banks of the Meander, which at the time, ancient Greek era, was famous for its hot springs. They might still have hot springs there, I'm not really sure. They could. Geothermal stuff takes long time periods, but at the time it was famous for its hot springs. And they think that perhaps because of this, Thales associated heat with water. Also, a little bit further upriver, there was these backwaters and very swampy area, and methane gas can escape from the surface of, swampy, stagnant water and, spontaneously ignite. So they think he might have seen these will-o-wisps and had some sort of revelation and been like, oh my God, fire comes from water. But it's just speculation. Maybe, maybe not. They theorize that he knows that clouds nourish plants, so he thought that the water just gradually became mud, it became stone
and
from
then
the
it somehow
mud.
Gave life.
And it gave life. And then he knew of the process of fusibility. Mm-hmm. Is that how you pronounce it?
What word are you trying to say? Fusibility?
Like liquefaction of stone.
Okay.
He knew that existed, and obviously silt was a important aspect of life in Egypt and Miletus.
And thinking about rocks is not good enough for Thales because he was a big thinker, so he extrapolated to the whole Earth and developed a theory about the whole Earth. There is a story that he experienced an earthquake and wondered what caused it. And of course, the Greeks knew what caused earthquakes. It was the Titans stamping their feet, or possibly two of the gods throwing boulders at one another in some epic fight.
Damn you, Zeus. Why are you doing this again?
But Thales seems to have noticed that the earthquake somehow was not just a shaking of the ground, but there was some kind of waves in the ground. Which is true, right? P waves, S waves. We know that earthquakes propagate in waves. And because he noticed this, he came up with this theory that the Earth is a disk and it floats on water, and the earthquake is actually what we experience when the water that the Earth is floating on, a wave ripples through underneath. Mm. So we experience that as an earthquake.
By the way,
makes a lot of sense, actually.
The disk is made of rock, which is also made of water, according to Thales. He was He was like the first guy to try to make a natural explanation of
right, instead of just some story or mythology.
Instead of blaming everything on Zeus
or gods.
I feel like they get a lot of blame.
He was the first natural philosopher.
Yeah. He also thought life came from water. All the Greeks believed in spontaneous generation, that life comes from nothing. So he noticed that in Egypt, when it rained, that there was these flocks or herds or what do you call like a bunch of mice in a gaggle of mice? A menace of mice? Is that a thing?
A murder of mice.
No, that's crows, man. That's crows.
Anyway, it's not unreasonable that he thought everything was water.
Yeah, he thought the mice were made of water.
I mean, if you live in a port town, a port city, most of what you see, you're surrounded by water. The earth is mostly water. Not unreasonable. I mean, if you're going to pick something, water's as good as anything else. Maybe
we give him too much credit, and he just was like, oh, everything is wet because I live near the ocean. Therefore, everything is made of water.
Everybody he knew lived near the ocean, though. I mean, the whole Greek civilization was, in the Aegean Sea, all the islands and all the port cities.
Yeah. Another theory is he lived in Egypt, and for at least a little bit, it's speculated, and there's an Egyptian creation myth that the god Nun, the god of chaos, was basically a whole sea, or I guess like a great watery abyss thing that was also a god, that was also like primordial ooze. And all of the creation myth is that everything was created out of this chaos and this water. So maybe he kind of associated that with the fact that Earth floated on water, or...
And there's one other thing. He noticed that a magnet, or a lodestone would attract certain kinds of rocks. And if you have a rock that everybody knows is about as dead as you can get, if a rock can move, then somehow it has to have some kind of animating principle inside of it.
Yeah, that's a slightly different thing. He thought that there were souls in everything.
Right.
And he thought the souls came from water, but I think he thought
that's tied up in his whole idea of monism.
Yeah.
So he thought that the indivisible particle of all of nature, that all of stuff was made out of, was something that had both matter and spirit in it, and therefore, in some sense, everything has, it's almost like like the force flows through everything. Before Thales, the Greeks believed that there was spirit and there was matter, and they were totally distinct, right? There's the whole myth about who's the guy that pushed the boulder up the hill?
Sif something?
No.
Sisyphus.
No.
It begins syphilis.
Who's the guy? No.
It's not syphilis, the the Greek monster.
Wait, I'm not. Okay, so there's a myth that.
Sisyphus.
No.
It's Sisyphus. I just looked it
Okay.
up. It's Sisyphus. Sisyphus.
All right, I'm going to look up the guy I'm thinking of.
I was right. Sisyphus was forced to carry an immense boulder up a hill,
Okay.
only for it to
So
roll
is
down every time it neared the top.
Sisyphus the same as Prometheus? Are those
No,
two-
Prometheus is the guy that had his liver eaten because
okay.
he gave humans fire.
So Prometheus supposedly created mankind out of clay by sculpting him out of clay. Yes, that's the myth. I'm looking at it right now.
I know Percy Jackson enough to know that was not in Percy Jackson.
Well, it's one of the myths. This is what Greeks believed in 600 BC. Prometheus created man by sculpting him out of clay, and Athena breathed life into them. So there was this idea that you have stuff and then you have spirit, and they're really two different things. Thales may have been the first to say, no, that's wrong. Whatever that's primordial stuff is, has a little spirit in it, which is what explains motion of water and magnetic rocks and swamp gas and everything else. And he famously said, there's no difference between living things and dead things, really. I don't know.
Inanimate and animate, I guess.
Animate and inanimate.
Yeah, he really was focused on movement, I think.
But if you think, just to go back a little, if you think about his whole model of nature of the Earth being a disk floating on water, explaining earthquakes, all that stuff, that was a lot closer than people give him credit for. Because even though the Earth is not a disk, the Earth is composed of disks, right? We call them tectonic plates now.
Yeah.
And they don't float on water, but they do float on a liquid, right?
Yeah, they
molten lava or molten rock in some sense.
The mantle.
The
It's
mantle.
like-
Well, it's a little plasticky.
I don't really know what the mantle is. Is it actually made of lava, or is it?
No, it's not actually made of lava. But point is, Thales wasn't as far off as people think. They think, oh, the Earth is a disk floating in water? Sure, Thales. Whatever you say. But he was actually not that far off.
I love how Aristotle liked Thales. He was like, this man is the first philosopher. Aristotle gave him a lot of credit. But then he got to his whole water floating on things theory, the Earth floating on water theory.
Aristotle thought that was garbage.
And Aristotle was like, this is shit. What is wrong with this man? He said, just as air is lighter than water, so water is lighter than earth. How then can the lighter substance lie underneath that which is naturally heavier? So Aristotle was like, this man is an idiot. Rocks don't float.
Yeah, he didn't know
Why
about the
does he think this?
He didn't know about the mantle, though, did he? And really, tectonic plates floating on the mantle is really exactly what causes earthquakes, isn't it?
Yeah, he was right.
He was right. He was right.
Good job,
So
Thales.
that's why I think he was a very good observer of nature.
And fun fact, his student, Axamander. You know, if I'm gonna name my kid that, I better learn how to pronounce it. I just really like the spelling. He actually kind of took off with the whole water thing and was like, yeah, life originated in the sea. Which is right. He was like, I won't say he predicted anything, but
Let's
their
just say-
fascination with water kind of
Let's just say he had
hit the mark.
pretty good scientific intuition.
Scientific is a long...
Natural philosophy intuition.
He was good at making guesses.
All right, that's fair. Well, they didn't have a lot to work on in 600 BC.
Yeah, imagine you don't know anything. I would be very confused about how the world
Most people
worked.
had to worry about where they're getting their next meal in 600 BC. So he also, Thales, supposedly, he was also an astronomer. He was a pretty keen observer of the sky. He knew about the North Star.
Yeah, they claim he actually was the guy who invented Ursa Minor.
Yes, there's some stories about how he just came up with that constellation for navigation. I don't know if that's true, but the fact that he knew about the North Star and that you use the North Star for navigation was significant. And he supposedly wrote an entire book on navigation, or navigating the seas by using the stars, but that book has been lost, if it ever really existed.
I love how he comes up with this constellation, this big lasting idea that's lasted until the present day, and he basically just plagiarizes the fact that there's already an Ursa Major. And he's like, we need an Ursa Minor.
Yeah, well,
the creativity of this man.
Ursa Major doesn't include the North Star. The North Star is the key star for navigation.
But does it really need to be another bear? I feel like he can think of
That's
another
true.
animal
He
with
may
his
have just
great big brain and creativity, being the distinguished first scientist, philosopher, mathematician.
Maybe a little bit
he
of
was.
celebrity syndrome going on there.
Yeah, I think he needs to think of a new animal. Maybe he should have gone with water. Maybe he should have just thought of mermaids. I'm not really sure.
So you mentioned Egypt. Most historians think he visited Egypt. He either went there to trade or he went there to study. In any event, he learned geometry there. And there's a famous story about how he used similar triangles to measure the height of the pyramids, obviously without actually climbing them, just using sort of a device like
A stick.
well, a stick, but like a stick that's sort of like a modern day surveyor's tool that could measure angles. And he just used similar triangles to measure the pyramid based on its shadow and its, the distance to the base and so on. So most historians think he actually did visit Egypt. And also Egypt had a tradition of geometry and math, which the Greeks didn't have at that time. Thales brought it to Greece, and then he expanded on it.
The Egyptians, I guess what Thales did was he turned math into more of a logical science, while the Egyptians, it was purely a tool. So the Egyptians had this thing where they had these rope stretchers called, this is going to be hard to pronounce, harpendor.
You nailed it.
I nailed it. Okay. Harp edon apte. Harpen on whatever. Rope stretchers, and they were surveyors that had these long ropes knotted at different intervals. So these long knotted cords, and they used it to mark up property demarcations, and they made actual right triangles using known proportions of right triangles. So they had like a 3, 4, 5 triangle, and they used that in measurement, and they used that in dividing up land for taxes and calculations to make, I guess, architecture.
Well, the interesting thing about math in this time was a lot of it was just empirical, which means they measured things and noticed patterns.
Yeah.
But until Thales, supposedly nobody thought that you could use deductive proofs to come up with mathematical patterns or truths. Like, for example, a triangle inscribed in a semicircle is has a right angle. That kind of thing.
So the Egyptians had this thing called mensuration.
Okay.
Is that
sounds like measuring stuff to me?
It sounds like menstruation to me.
Well,
it's not a.
You read that, not me. What is that?
It's considered the branch of mathematics that studies, instead of studying shapes like geometry, it studies, I guess, parameters of shapes like length, volume, surface area, things like that. They also had this thing from almost 1,000 years before Thales where it wasn't quite an angle. It was more of, they thought of angles as more of inclinations. It was more of a feature of a shape or a substance than an actual theoretical concept. But they had these things called secants, which were basically the magnitude of inclination of things like the pyramid. So if Thales went over to Egypt, he would know that they had this exact way of measuring things and this, I guess, fascination with length and volume and shapes. And the Greeks loved shapes, and Thales was like, I like this. And he took it back to Greece. Do you want to talk about how he has, what are his five theorems? He has some discoveries attributed to him.
Well, he's supposedly discovered 5 different theorems that made their way into Euclid's Elements, and he's still known for today. Hey, can I back up?
Yeah, sure.
I just remembered something. I think I actually know why Miletus was so wealthy. I read this. So Miletus was about 20 miles from this mine that had a lot of gold and silver. And Miletus was thought to be possibly the first place on Earth that actually minted coins, like modern coins. There was the idea of currency, but there was no metal coins until Miletus. And I think these coins existed sometime before Thales was born, but not that much before. So they were invented sometime around 650 BC or something like that. And they were made out of something called electrum, which was what was found in this mine. And
what
it was basically the equivalent of vibranium in the ancient world. So Miletus was Wakanda.
Okay, that's a stretch, but all right.
So electrum was some kind of alloy of gold and silver. But they were the first real coins, and they still have these coins today, and they were stamped out.
Is Thales on any of them?
Thales is not on any of them, but they do have, some of them do have geometric shapes.
Thales.
And the rulers of Miletus made tons of money by simply stamping out these coins, the metal coming from a mine about 20 miles to the north. And it was just like Bitcoin, everybody wanted one because it was easy to conduct trade when you had coins. So I think that has something to do with their wealth. I feel like
if I was an ancient Greek guy and someone
which is also, by the way, that several people tried to conquer Miletus during Thales' lifetime.
Honestly, if I was an ancient Greek and I didn't know what a coin was, and someone... I gave someone, like, I built a house for someone, and someone was like, oh, instead of paying me in food, they just gave me, like, this metal thing.
Well, they had currency.
I would be very offended.
They had currency, right? They just didn't have coins. They had... The Romans had salt, right, as currency.
There was no
I don't know what the currency was before 600 BC, but we know people traded shells and different kinds of things. So there was the idea of currency. There just wasn't metal coins yet. I still think electrum is vibranium.
Sure. Anyway, do you want to list some of his
I'm doing history here. I'm doing new history. I'm making it up as I go.
Okay.
This is exciting.
I can tell you're excited. You look very excited.
So, do the ox story.
No, Dad. We have to go through the theorems first.
All right. Well, the ox story is related to the theorems, no?
Dad, you have to go through the theorems and explain it first. You
go through the theorems.
You go through the theorems.
Well, the only one I like, I could...
Go through the one you like.
4 throwaway theorems, to be honest. The one that's good is...
Yeah, one of the theorems
If you draw a triangle in a semicircle, inside a semicircle, he proved that it has to be a right-angled triangle. That was not known.
You have to hype him up, Dad.
Actually, it was known for special cases. I believe it was known for isosceles triangles only.
I think Thales was the first guy who discovered that the angles of an isosceles triangle are also equal and not just the sides.
That's correct. That's another one of his theorems. Maybe the Egyptians didn't care that much about angles, but Thales proved a bunch of things for angles. He also proved that if you have a triangle, or you have 2 triangles, and you have 2 of the angles in one triangle are similar to 2 of the angles in the other triangle plus one side, then the triangles are similar. And he used that to do a lot of stuff.
We'll get to that.
Yeah.
Yeah, so he gets a lot of credit for some reason for some of his throwaway theorems, which is what you called them. And I think people... He
may or may not have come up with them.
I think people were kind of impressed by the arguments he made, which we don't actually have any record of. But one of his theorems is if you draw a line through the center of a circle, so a diameter through a circle, you... Listen to this. This is brilliant. You cut it in half. It doesn't cut in thirds. It cuts in halves. If you cut the circle in halves, it is 2 equal parts.
Well, it turns out that proving that a diameter that cuts a circle in half actually goes through the center of the circle is not completely trivial to prove, given what they knew.
You have to fold it in half.
They didn't have folding, and they probably didn't have paper, but...
They had papyrus, although I don't think the Greeks really were into that life.
That was one of his easier ones, I believe, but he didn't have a lot to work with.
Yeah. But I think people were impressed because he had this thing where it was like proof by demonstration. And I can just imagine him folding a whole bunch of circles in half and is like, oh, look at this, guys. It always works. Although that probably isn't what happened.
No, he didn't do it by example. That's the whole point. He did it by deduction.
Isn't that the same thing? Demonstration and deduction? Kind of.
Demonstration's more like for special cases. He used pure reason. He proved it for every triangle.
How is it a special case? No.
We're just talking about the circle. Okay.
How is it a special case? There's one way to do it.
I don't actually know how he did that, but it has to do with the center.
Yeah, I think the whole point was he had a definition of a circle, and he said, there's a logical consequence to this definition.
Exactly.
And it's not just an all-encompassing definition. There's a statement, and then there's... What do you call a consequence in math?
A consequence?
Yeah.
A theorem.
This proves this. Not a theorem, but like a smaller... No, is there not a word for that?
Consequence.
Okay. You're useless. Yeah, so he basically... Induction? What's the difference between induction and deduction? I always forget this. Sherlock Holmes uses it wrong,
Induction is just showing something's true for every number. And then, if it's true for one number, it's true for the next number. Deduction is more like using logic.
Oh, okay. So Sherlock Holmes does have it wrong when he says, yeah, okay. So
Okay, so we got the
how do
circle
how do
thing,
you-
we got
how
the
do we-
isosceles triangle thing. He also proved that if you have two straight lines that intersect, which creates four angles, right? Like an X,
Yeah.
that he proved that the two angles that face each other are equal. So it creates two pairs of angles, two equal pairs.
Like the vertical angles theorem?
Yeah, that was him.
Oh. Good job, Thales.
That's one of his. And then, are we missing one?
Well, how about we go through a proof for his only non-trivial theorem?
Okay.
The one with an angle inscribed in a semicircle
It would be hard to
has
do
to
on
be a right angle.
hard to do on a podcast, but I think what he did was he created two. He took a triangle inscribed in a semicircle, and he drew a line from the center of the circle to the vertex that's on the circle, that's not on the diameter.
So he drew a radius.
He drew a radius. He divided the triangle into two triangles. And then he showed that the two triangles are similar. And then he showed that the sum of the angles...
The two triangles... Let's try to describe this, I guess, a little more visually.
All right, so you have a semicircle.
Yes.
And you have a triangle, and only one of the vertices of the triangle is on the circle. The other two are at the base of the diameter, right?
Yeah. So they're at the bottom of the semicircle.
Then you just draw a line dividing the triangle in half. Not in half, but...
So you draw a radius from the point in the circle to the...
center of the circle. And then those two triangles are similar because two of the sides are radii of each of those triangles.
So when you cut the diameter at the bottom in half, you get two radii. And then you already have another radii.
Right, they're both isosceles triangles. So you don't start with an isosceles triangle, but you can cut it in such a way that you have two isosceles triangles now.
Is that where his proof about the isosceles stuff comes in?
He probably uses that. He definitely uses that.
Where the
angles are the same.
The angles are the same for an isosceles triangle.
And then you just use simple algebra to show that the angle has to be 90 at the vertex.
Do you need to know?
You need to know that the sum of the angles are...
It was known
that the sum of the angles of a triangle equal two right triangles, which is basically 180.
Okay.
But nowadays we don't say it in that way, but they knew, or at least Egyptian math knew, that the sum of the angles of a triangle is equal to two right triangles, which is 180. That's what they already knew. Or maybe, I don't think he found that out. That was something that he used in the proof.
Okay. Good job, Thales.
Not really the best. Going through proofs isn't the best thing to do on a podcast, but that's it.
I think we could do it. We just need to get better at explaining it.
We're going to have trouble if we're going to be doing like Grothendieck theorems on a podcast without any visual aids.
I don't even think they use visual aids at that advanced.
All right, so what?
But anyway, that's how you prove that a right angle made on the side of a circle will have two lines cross the circle at diametrically opposed points. So I learned that word today.
Whether or not...
That's by far his best proof.
Yeah, and he supposedly was so delighted when he proved this that he sacrificed an ox.
I love how he was like, I proved the first mathematical discovery ever. I also hate this ox and I have to kill it. I don't know. It kind of brings the question of he's thought of as this logical sort of guy who attributed all these natural phenomenon to a known substance instead of Zeus or the gods or some sort of supernatural creation. And then he sacrifices an ox. Like, who is he sacrificing it to? Like water as a concept?
Well, he started an important trend in mathematics because
Sacrificing oxes?
Sure, many subsequent mathematicians have sacrificed oxes, oxen.
Is
When
an ox?
Terence Tao won the Fields Medal, he totally sacrificed an ox. That is a true story.
Has he told you this?
It's not well known. No, it's sort of a...
Is this what he talks about in his class?
It's totally true. No. Yes.
Terence Tao, some animal rights groups are going to come after you soon. Be prepared.
In a semicircle, the arc of the circle that it crosses or that it describes of any angle in a semicircle is half the angle of the same arc of an angle that starts in the center of the circle.
Yeah, that's a general case of the right angle application, right?
Well, it's not a general case, but it's just the angle at the circumference of the circle is half the angle if the vertex is moved to the middle of the circle. A special case of that is the right angle theorem. But I think he also proved that. So that's maybe one of those other theorems isn't really a theorem. It's more like a corollary. I don't know.
Yeah, so the measure of an inscribed angle
that's it.
Is half the measure of the...
Well, you have an inscribed angle that is from the center of the circle, and you have another inscribed angle that's at the circumference of the circle. If they sketch out the same arc of the circle, one is half the other, right?
Yeah.
That's not really obvious, but it's true, and he proved that. Wasn't obvious to me when I learned that, which was whatever, 5th grade or 6th grade. Like that.
Okay.
I actually remember thinking that's not obvious at all.
Person that took geometry in 5th grade.
I don't know if it was geometry, but it was
most people take geometry freshman year of high school.
No. Well, maybe I'm just misremembering, but I actually remember thinking that is not obvious, but cool nevertheless.
Of course you did. Of course that's one of your memories of elementary school.
Whether or not he proved these things, he definitely used these facts in a very clever way. Supposedly when he was in Egypt, he used the idea of similar triangles to measure the height of the pyramid just by looking at the shadow it casts.
How?
You know, you set up something like a little tool that's like a surveyor's tool, and you have two of them, and you create a triangle where the pyramid casts a shadow, and you compare the pyramid shadow to the shadow cast by a stick, a vertical stick, and you set up some similar triangles. You replicate the angle. So you have an angle that the top of the pyramid makes with your surveying tool, and then you set up another surveying tool which creates the same angle for just an ordinary 10-foot high stick, and then you have two similar triangles. You can just use ratios to calculate the height of the pyramid.
Knew. I think he only knew it for the special case of when it was an isosceles triangle. So when your shadow equaled your height, then he knew that the shadow was the same length as the height in both the, I guess, test apparatus and the pyramid.
I don't think you need isosceles triangles, but
you don't need that. But I think that's the only way he actually applied it.
The exact same idea to measure the width of a river that he doesn't need to cross. As long as you have some kind of landmark on the other side of the river, you can measure the width of the river at any given point by creating two similar triangles. He also supposedly was able to guess or calculate the distance of a ship in a harbor. Maybe it was like 2 miles from the port, or 3 miles or 5 miles. He was able to figure out exactly how far away it was. Presumably he'd be standing on some high ground looking down on it, but
Yeah.
and he would, I guess he would have to know the height of the mast or something. You couldn't
And
do
he'd
this.
need to know his own elevation, I guess. Right?
Not necessarily, as long as he wasn't too high up. But you could, yeah. Well, you might, yeah. If you really wanted to be accurate, you'd need to know your elevation. But he would probably be able to figure that out. And what else did he do?
Well, apparently he got so excited when...
He also used the same idea to figure out the size of the sun.
He figured out the size of the sun?
I think he did. He figured out that the sun...
No way did he get that right.
He knew that the sun was... It took up an angle of 1/2 of 1 degree in the sky.
Oh my god, was this one of the crazy guys like Newton where he just stared at the sun to see how...
No, I don't know how he did it, but Thales was an astronomer and he was looking at the sun and he somehow calculated a ratio, I think, based on the angle that the sun took up in the sky. He may have simply calculated the ratio of the sun's diameter to the moon's diameter. But he was pretty close.
Zero? The ratio of the sun's diameter to the moon's diameter?
I don't know. I don't remember exactly, but he used this idea of similar triangles.
Well, speaking of that, he did supposedly predict an eclipse.
That's right. And there was a solar eclipse when he was 45 years old. We know this. It was in the year 585. We even know the month and the day. Is that correct? We don't know for sure that he was able to do this, but this is...
I read that we actually only know approximately how old he was because we know the date of the solar eclipse. And they kind of worked backwards. It was the 28th of May, 585 BC. And Herodotus, the great historian, thought that the eclipse happened during a battle between the
Lydians.
The Lydians and who?
The Medes.
The Medes? Were the Medes Persians?
Yes.
Okay.
The Lydians were the people who lived in the western part of Turkey.
Okay. So this was a battle in central Turkey, or what is now central Turkey. Basically, the sun just went out in the middle of the battle. Day turned to night. And predictably, everyone freaked the fuck out, trying to figure out why the sun was gone. They made a peace treaty and ended a 6-year war because the gods were angry at them. If the sun goes out every time you start fighting, I think I would probably stop fighting.
Anyway, Thales got credit for it.
Yeah, Thales got credit for it when he probably shouldn't have. They think that perhaps he just copied from the Babylonians, who were known to... They knew the idea of eclipse cycles. So eclipses go in cycles that you can actually predict, and the ancients actually noticed this. They think that perhaps Thales got this from the Babylonians. It's kind of disputed because... The whole account is kind of disputed because, the eclipse battle was at the very end of the evening. So it wasn't in the middle of the day, and it didn't turn the day into night. It was at like 7:30 in the evening or something. They think that maybe because Thales was just such a legend at that time, and he said that, eclipse is going to happen again, They were just like, he predicted it.
Let's just say there's some holes in that story.
Yeah, there's some holes in that story.
If you use math from Babylon and astronomical observations from Babylon to make this prediction, it kind of doesn't make sense because the eclipse would probably have not been visible in Babylon. But maybe, he may still have somehow figured it out. He's a smart guy. Or maybe he was predicting eclipses every single year for 20 years in a row, and he finally got one right. Who knows? Who knows?
They think that perhaps he was looking at something called the Saros cycle, but there's some doubt that that was even possible because the eclipses in that cycle don't always happen and are visible in the same area of the world. It's a little too unpredictable for people like him to have figured this out. Also, one of his students, Axamander, started predicting earthquakes, and he got the credit of predicting earthquakes, or a earthquake, which is clearly not possible because us in 2021 cannot predict earthquakes, which doesn't really lead credence to the idea that Thales predicted an eclipse, because the Greeks thought that they were equally hard to predict.
What else do we know about him? Oh, how about his olive oil scam? I'll tell the story real quick. Aristotle wrote that something about somebody mocking Thales for philosophy being completely useless. And Aristotle said, even though Thales was in poverty, which doesn't make sense if he was from a very well-off family, but maybe it just means he was ascetic, right? Didn't believe in a lot of material things, lived simply, whatever. To prove this guy or to show him up, he decided he was going to just make a whole bunch of money. He came up with this scheme.
Imagine that.
According to Aristotle, predicted a bumper crop of olives well before, like 6 months before the harvest, and somehow used that information to rent up all the olive presses and supposedly made a killing by re-renting them for like triple the price when the demand was high. But even now, we can't really predict.
What's the word for that?
Agricultural bumper crops. But this is the story. Monopoly.
A monopoly, but yeah, I guess monopoly is probably the right word. I think that the people on Wikipedia.
Well, it's in Aristotle's writing, so he knew about Thales, even though it was 250 years later. And this is a story I heard, and it was the context was somebody was mocking Thales. So to prove that guy wrong, he made a fortune predicting that olives would be, or olive presses would be in demand.
Can I have that superpower? Just making a fortune out of spite.
Well, there's stories like this for every Greek philosopher had to justify why philosophy was useful. There's a story like that for Socrates. There's a story like that for Plato. And so apparently
I've never thought about it. I thought they were just kind of fun anecdotes that have very little historical value.
It was kind of a thing because I get, and also the other thing about Thales is he started this school, right? And he had students, and his students were an Axamander, an Axamenus.
Dude, that's such a cool name.
Right? So you gotta say.
I hope you realize that I'm going to name one of your grandchildren an Axamander.
You could name one of your dogs an Axamander. That would be cool. I'd be cool with that.
No, it's going to be a child. It's going to be a human child. It's a very cool name.
Well, an Axamander, we're not really sure who was the teacher and who's the student, but Pythagoras was also part of this school. Probably.
Pythagoras was supposedly 4 generations removed.
No, he was only 50 or 55 years younger than Thales.
Well, it went Thales, Anaximander, Anaximenes.
Menace, right?
Menace.
Anaximenes.
But then Pythagoras.
Or it's possible Thales taught all of them. They weren't that far apart in years. And Pythagoras was born only 20 miles away, off the coast of where Miletus is, on an island called Samos. The idea of a school and teachings and passing it on was probably a brand new idea. There really weren't academies. And if not for his idea of creating this school, passing on his knowledge, maybe Pythagoras would not have created his own school, the Pythagorean school. So that's kind of important too, as part of his legacy. Of course, also, Pythagorean school was very important. It was hundreds and hundreds of students.
Also, going back to the olive thing, Wikipedia gives him credit for the creation and the first historically known use of futures and the use of options, which I think is giving him a little bit too much credit. But he also invented finance.
I think that's just options traders wanting to make themselves more important than they are.
Yeah, I think that's probably right. Which is an odd place to go. If I wanted to make myself more important than I actually am, I don't think my first thought would be to go to Thales. But maybe that's just me. Maybe I'm just weird.
Well, yeah, it's pretty common to find the roots of some endeavor in antiquity and thereby making it seem way more important than it is. Right? No matter what that thing is.
Yeah, true.
Just trace it back to antiquity and suddenly it's legit.
What did you learn researching Thales that you didn't know before, just for the ending gimmick of our podcast? We need a gimmick, right?
That's how you're leading in?
Yeah, we need a gimmick.
Gimmicky ending?
What else? What else do you call this?
I did learn something. That has nothing to do with Thales, just something new I learned reading about it. You know how the western coast of ancient Turkey is called Ionia? And that Thales school was sometimes referred to as the Ionian school?
Yeah.
Well, I always wondered why that was the case when the Ionian Sea is way on the other side of Greece, several hundred miles away. Because the west coast of Turkey is on the Aegean Sea. So the Ionian Sea is like where Italy is, the east coast of Italy. So why is the west coast of Turkey called Ionia?
All right, you're leading me on now. Why is it?
Well, there's a reason, it turns out. And it is that there's something called the Ionian people, which was a tribe from 2000 BC who came down and settled the western coast of Greece on the shores of the Ionian Sea. And over 1,000 years, they either were pushed eastward or migrated eastward to the point where they actually ended up on the other side of the Aegean Sea. So archaeologists can show that there are settlements in Western Greece, Central Greece, Eastern Greece. Over time, they moved east, and they eventually colonized the islands and then ended up in Western Turkey. And the Ionian people became the Greek people, or at least one of a number of tribes that coalesced into the Greek people and the Greek nation. Kind of like Anglo-Saxons became the British, kind of like that.
I didn't
know any of that. But I always wondered because of the geography, and I just never bothered to look it up until now.
I feel like that happens a lot, where people move around and then the place names stay.
Probably.
What did I learn? Honestly, I didn't really know anything about Thales before this, but Oh, I learned the word magnet comes from a place in Greece called like magnesia, something magnet. I did not know that. From your face, I can tell that you did know that.
I'm just looking for the ending.
Okay. Let's finish this.